But let us continue into part B. Part B, just continuing where we left off. The nation's out for blood, just the way competitive human beings seeking to dominate each other are out for blood. It may be done in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the religious sphere. It doesn't make any difference. We seek to kill the enemy rather than absorb the value of the enemy and have those other values influence our values for the good. Alexander the Great, for all of his tendency towards conquest, was strongly motivated by the fourth ray, I believe, and seemed to absorb the best values of the civilizations and groups that he conquered, especially Persia in this case. But that's not the sixth ray attitude. The sixth ray attitude is to completely annihilate the conquered group or to enslave them. And it's amazing the calls for slavery that are still emerging in our modern era. Even sex slavery. This coming in under Mars, which we have just been seeing, rules sex. So there's a strong scorpionic tendency here, Scorpio in the lower aspect, to reawaken the Hydra and allow the Hydra to dominate. But all of this will be swept aside in the general cleansing that Aquarius will bring with the two rivers, the Alpheus and Peneus, sweeping through the stables of King Algaeus, cleansing all the three levels. This is inevitable, but many who call for the reawakening of very ancient attitudes don't see forward. They see only backward. This is a great danger. And the sixth ray has a sentimental, reactionary side to it, which seeks to seek former glory. Whenever former glory is sought, we are in a position which will lead to destruction and despair. The Italians in World War I sought the former glory of Rome. The Germans sought the former glory of the magnificent Teuton, who had been somehow corrupted. The Jewish group seeks to re-establish the ancient land of Israel. The Islamic group, some of them seek to re-establish the conquered caliphate. Former glory is always a dangerous pursuit and is no true vision of the descending plan which the intuition reveals. So all of these negative characteristics, says DK, these are sixth ray characteristics emphasized by Scorpio and conditioned by Mars. Scorpio is the greater entity here, the lord of the constellation Scorpio, and the lesser lord of the planet Mars, which is kind of a student, you might say, of the lord of the constellation Scorpio. So all these are sixth ray characteristics emphasized by Scorpio. The application conditioned by the militancy, the warlike nature of Mars, whichever rules the path of the individual disciple. Interesting. Mars ruling the path of the individual disciple. It seems discipleship is necessarily, as we understand it, at least on Earth, filled with conflict. We do live on a conflicted planet, and we are graduates of a school of purifying pain and releasing sorrow. We live on a planet of painful endeavor, and so much of the pain is caused by the clash of battle, the conflict brought on by Mars, a major contributing planet to the psychic and energic condition of the Earth at this time and of humanity at this time. So it seems that one cannot really be a disciple unless one is ready to battle on behalf of the higher aspect of oneself with the reassertion, strenuous reassertion of the lower aspect of oneself. And today the world disciple, humanity as a whole, stands at the very portal of the path and is engaged. Well, this was written in the interim between two great wars, which DK sees as one great war, 1914 to 1945. So even though this was written in the early 30s, I suppose the masters knew in a way that they were involved in a larger war, a larger process, and could see ahead to the possibility, although they strove strenuously through goodwill initiatives to avoid the second phase of the precipitation of the war. So even then, humanity was the world disciple, today involved in all manner of conflicts and the attempt to reconcile conflicts under the United Nations. Humanity still stands at the very portal of the path, with the Aquarian energy getting stronger and stronger all the time, and bringing the universal love of the Christ closer. But as that love descends, of course, it evokes its opposite. The entire West is at this time under Martian influence, but this will end during the next 5 years. Well, okay, it's difficult to know exactly when sections of this book were written, but we do seem to be relatively in an early part of the book, which seems to have been written relatively in the mid-30s. And so this influence apparently did not really end, unless he's speaking of the influence as it manifests on the inner planes and then gradually has to work out and through the outer planes. Let's see what further may be said here, because certainly, great aspects of the war were in expression during the early 40s, and even up to the winter of 1942 in the North. It was not known which way humanity would go, or whether humanity would go down to defeat. So certainly the Martian influence was very, very strong. Later, I think he talks about the power of Mars waning, but that is towards the end of the war. So one wonders whether it was artificially somehow prolonged. Maybe DK was really hoping. Let's say this was written in the middle 30s, 34, 35, 36. Going forward by a few years, it could have taken us to the end of the 30s, beginning of the 40s. Maybe he was hoping that the next phase of the war would not precipitate. It certainly was a possibility that it need not have precipitated, but enough men and women of goodwill, we are told, could not be found to stem the tide of the warlike forces. So we've had Mars governing the physical body and personality. We've had Mars governing sex and the blood. Let's see here. Yes, sex and the blood. And now he comes to the third factor, which Mars governs, Thirdly, Mars governs the senses, which are 5 in number. He seems in a way to be moving up through the planes. There'll be some connection of Mars with the lower concrete mind, whose number is 5 as well. So Mars is actually the acuity of the way we interact with our environment, the senses, 5 in number. The number 5, I think, does relate to a higher aspect of Mars. I've suspected that one of the monadic rays of Mars is the 5th. This would correlate pretty well with Paul, as under the Martian influence, because if he had a 6th ray soul, for a while at least, giving way to the 2nd ray, his particular influence at the moment is very much under the 5th ray. Being the 5th ray Chohan, Mars is interestingly a rather orange planet. Not just a red planet, but red-orange, correlating with the 5th ray, orange being the color of the 5th ray. Interestingly enough, some of the color presented by Venus seems to be orange as well, indicating exteriorly perhaps the 5th ray nature of that planet. So Mars is involved with the concrete mind. These senses are the basis of all human knowledge, presumably the knowledge of the concrete mind, where that which is tangible and objective is concerned or inferred. So Mars is not a subtle planet. It deals with objectivity and tangibility and is very much involved in promoting the materialistic perspective. But of course, Martian science must give way to a more subtle science, ruled perhaps by, let us call it, the occult mind of Uranus and the higher aspects of Mercury and Neptune's sensitivity and so forth. So the 5 senses, and it's kind of interesting, people with a strong Mars sometimes have a quite prominent lower brow from the physiognomic perspective, and that may indicate their engagement with that which the senses reveals, their engagement with objectivity. It's not so much the higher forehead which is involved. That's more under the realm of Jupiter. The study of physiognomy in relation to the planets, I think, is very important, and in relation to the zodiacal signs. It's complex. There's much fusing and blending going on, but perhaps the eye can become discerning enough to detect these planetary and zodiacal influences on that form which is the body and especially the face, as the more acute revealer of identity. Mars, therefore, rules science. Okay. And I do believe in the Goklan research that it was not only Saturn that was found prominent in the charts of scientists, but Mars as well. Mars is this power to engage with the environment, to investigate, to learn about it. Of course, Pluto helps this tendency to engage and discover, to go even deeper. So Mars and Pluto are probing. I think they make very good planets of surgery when together. So Mars rules science. Very interesting, because you might not think this to be the case. You think, okay, here's Venus, the planet of the 5th ray. Why doesn't Venus rule science? But from a practical perspective, when we look at how people actually behave under the influence of these planets, we see that Venus is much more involved with the arts than with science per se. The statistical work has to be done. I think it is being done by some. Goklan started his work, but there's much, much more that can be done. And then astrology will prove itself statistically, mathematically, and the skepticism surrounding it and the imputation of mindless mysticism surrounding it will be lifted, dissipate. So Mars therefore rules science, and hence the reason in this present era, however long that is, for the fundamental but not permanent materiality of science. So, science has been quite material for hundreds of years. Alchemy was given up, astrology was given up, no longer considered worthy of the universities. And for all through the 1600s, 17, 18, 1900s, scientific pursuits have been largely of a material nature, and necessarily so, I suppose, to give us a foundational understanding of the densest physical levels. Interesting. Mars and the materiality of science. Materiality which is rapidly lessening as Mars nears the end of its present cycle of influence. Okay, I just have to find where that went. The end of its present cycle of influence. Later there's some discussion about the waning of its power, at least on the astral plane. Today, I won't say that scientists are equally divided between material and subtle approaches, but if we think of the last 100 years, science has been taken into a realm, both in medicine and in physics, which is decidedly non-material. It is material in a more fundamental sense. The very constituents of matter are being understood, but these constituents are seen to be energy constituents and not illusorily solid, as it were. Matter has become appreciated as energy. So this is a tremendous revelation, proven in a way through the atomic bomb, but certainly presented to us in the speculation of Einstein and later the quantum physicists. So a new approach to science is on its way. And I would say, in a way, it's very Uranian, although at one point DK also associates Uranus with more orthodox science, but certainly the higher potentials of Uranus to investigate the subtle, the waves, the invisible, as real, is prominent. So material science is giving way to the study of the etheric vehicle. Mars doesn't have much to do with the etheric vehicle at all. Other planets, Mercury, Uranus, ruling Aquarius and Gemini, are far more etheric in their associations. Already the trend of modern science, and this is written in the 30s, is shifting into the realm of the intangible and into the world of the non-material. At least you can no longer perceive the objects of study of the science of that period and of the present period with the ordinary senses. The senses have to be greatly extended. One thinks about now, 80 years later, for the search for the God particle. Particle physics certainly has taken us into the realm of the intangible and into the world of the non-material, where matter and energy are understood as equivalent. This is a tremendous releasing formula, that matter is energy, energy is matter. It opens the door to magic and the possibility of precipitation from subtler realms into dense, and of dematerialization from dense realms into subtle. So we see that DK's indications are correct, even though, let us say, from 1950 to the year 2000, the emphasis upon the fifth ray ashram was lessened for the sake of humanity, lest its knowledge of these things run too far ahead of its social and moral development. Hence also the fact that the opposition to occultism is waning. I guess Mars and the Martian religions would put up a very great opposition to occultism because it challenges the familiar world. We see many vestigial sixth-ray types living in a type of consciousness which can only be described as material, and even when it's spiritual, it's materially spiritual. Spiritual materialism. So the heaven as conceived, the other world as conceived, is still very material. But anyway, that is not the occult perspective, nor is it the mystical perspective. And the opposition to occultism is waning. It's a Martian opposition. And its day of power is approaching. Did HPB tell us by the end of the 21st century? She put it in terms which are more difficult to understand, but I believe that what we call occultism must win the day by the end of the 21st century. That gives us another 90 years of work, and with the speed with which things are occurring, revelations are occurring, it doesn't seem impossible at all. These subtler senses will supersede the physical senses over which Mars has so long had a successful control. How very interesting. Its association with the lower fifth ray. Just the way, in a sense, we can say that Venus is associated with the higher fifth ray, and also Uranus is there as well, and Mercury as well. They all have, I think, fifth ray components. So these subtler senses will supersede the physical senses. Already with Kirlian photography we see this, and with the study of auras we see this. In the field of medicine, that's another frontier where subtle energy is emerging as a reality. Medicine and physics, these seem to be the two areas where pioneering research is occurring, although it's much more accepted generally in the area of nuclear physics, but increasingly enlightened physicians are understanding the energy treatment. These subtler senses will supersede the physical senses over which Mars has so long had a successful control. It's something like the transition from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. It's as if the type of physics which Newton brought to such a pinnacle of understanding is more Martian in nature. But the physics of the late 19th, early 20th, and now 21st century sees the waning of the Martian influence. And hence again, the growth in the world today of the psychic senses. This is under Neptune, isn't it? And the appearance on every hand of the subtler and more esoteric powers of clairvoyance and clairaudience. So here and there have been accurate psychics. I guess Jeffrey Hudson is a good example of a level-headed, intelligent, respectable psychic, and I'm sure there are many more working in psychic research under the fifth and seventh rays. But I think using the general sensitivity of Neptune, and in a way, Mars can be considered a kind of polar opposite of Neptune. Neptune, the planet of subtlety, of water, of life, and Mars, the planet of objectivity, of blood, and of matter and lower energy. Yeah. So I would not at all be surprised to see scientists involved in psychic research having a strong Neptune in their chart. And of course, if they wish to correlate what is found with the conventional revelation of the senses, perhaps Mars is strong as well, and Saturn is very important. the blend of subtlety, Neptune, and concrete nature, Saturn, Mars, is important for the corroboration of that which the subtle senses reveals. So this development is inevitable as the influence of Scorpio and of Mars begins to lessen, as is the case today. Now, here is a statement which makes me think that some of what was written here has been interpolated from later writings. It doesn't say the year 1945 will see this influence almost completely vanish, but it seems to suggest that the writing has occurred after 1945. So I'm not sure how this was all put together, but the year 1945 saw this, I suppose, cruder Martian influence, this influence almost completely vanish, particularly from the astral plane. I suppose people had no more desire to fight after 1945, in an era which was intended to see the building of the peace through the United Nations did supervene. So sometimes when we're looking at these books, even though we know when certain parts of them were written, other parts may have been interpolated from later periods. The book came out in terms of lessons, and maybe when these lessons were assembled and later published as books, a mixture was present. I suspect that Esoteric Astrology was not published as a book until the 1950s. Anyway, when DK then could be speaking of the period 1950, in which we would see the waning of the Martian influence, he said it would be within the next 5 years or so, it would wane. And if he's writing around the year 1945, then it's understandable that he's talking about a time ahead. So a materiality lessening as Mars nears the end of its present cycle of influence. Okay. So the year 1945 saw this influence almost entirely vanish, particularly from the astral plane. There's still, many, many wars are going on, and sometimes astonishing to realize how many wars, smaller wars, have occurred during the 20th century. Indeed, a warring century. We sometimes think only in terms of the major wars, but many lesser wars have been occurring. So anyway, the ruling of the astral plane by Mars is very important, because where there is the desire for fighting, it's far more serious than the working out upon the physical plane of occasional skirmishes. When the desire wanes, fighting upon the physical plane will also wane. But again, we almost see, strangely, as Mars approached its closest position to the Earth in many years, it's the closest in 70,000 years, just recently, a couple, 3 years ago, was it? There has again been the rising of the desire to fight, the kind of Armageddon consciousness, and the desires associated with that. Some sixth-ray types seeking to bring this on because it promises the end of a limited world and the onset of a paradisical world, a heavenly world, and others because it promises the domination of their ideology over other ideologies. So again, the desire to fight has been rising. This is some 60 years later. So let us see when the Tibetan again writes how he describes this particular period in relation to the planet Mars. Astrologers would do well to remember that the influence of the constellations, signs, and planets works out upon 3 levels of awareness. This is one of those important hints. 3 descending levels, and are felt first of all upon the mental plane, then upon the astral plane, and finally upon the physical plane. Well, I think there are certain descending influences which will continue to work out on the physical plane, even though a keen desire for their working out is no longer sustaining them. But where the astral plane, at least in some, is becoming re-energized for a great battle, then we can only hope that the fading out of the 6-ray cycle somehow neutralizes the possibility of this desire for battle precipitating upon the physical plane. There are so many intricate cycles. DK speaks of cycles of which we can have no knowledge. And he gives their starting points as years which we might never think of as starting points. So there are greater and lesser cycles, and about them we know very little, but we must know more. And when all knowledge is achieved on the 3rd level of the atmic plane, presumably by a master, then this type of knowledge of cycles will be ours. Right now we have to piece this knowledge together as best we can. Some have done a good job with this, taking the hints that are given and discerning some cyclic truth. I think Stephen Pugh has done a good job with this, piecing together the probable ray cycles, but there's still much more with cycles and subcycles and sub-subcycles and so forth, which are indeed relevant. Okay, but it is with this last plane, namely the physical plane, that the astrologers are primarily concerned. He's speaking of very esoteric astrologers. They're working, excuse me, very much in the realm of effects. So, they are emphasizing happenings and events and not their conditioning causes. Well, that's one of the ways in which esoteric astrology will decrease our ignorance in this area. It will emphasize conditioning causes which inevitably work out, and then attention will be placed upon dealing with the causes and not simply with the effects. And in that way we shall become much more effective in changing and transforming those conditions which must be changed and transformed. At present, DK says astrology deals with effects and not with that which is causing them. But I think those of us who have studied esoteric astrology, we do realize that we are shifting our understanding into the world of causes. There is much confusion over this matter, and the horoscopes of the 3 levels are often much distorted. It must have been very new information at the time it was given. A horoscope which could be interpreted purely upon the mental plane is given a physical interpretation, and thus happenings which are entirely mental are portrayed as physical occurrences. You kind of wonder how these horoscopes can be set up. Do we leave the horoscope as it is? Do we put a particular planet which rules a particular plane on the ascendant of the horoscope and thus create a house configuration which more truly represents activity upon the particular plane associated with that planet? There's much experimentation which can be done. But of course the realm of imagination, of fancy enters, so we have to make sure that our multiple speculations are actually correlated with facts and not arbitrarily imposed upon facts, skewing the interpretation, the correct interpretation of those facts. So thus, happenings which are entirely mental are portrayed as physical occurrences. And when we're interpreting horoscopes, we have to speak of changes in mind, changes in the emotional nature, finally, changes in the realm of physical plane effects. A clue to this triple interpretation which astrology must eventually recognize can be found in the relation of the orthodox, the esoteric, and hierarchical planets and the rays of which they are the expression. I do know that some astrologers have taken this sentence and have made a correlation of orthodox planets with the realm of physical events, of esoteric planets with emotional changes, and with of hierarchical planets and rulers with changes upon the mental plane. We can see the extent to which this actually does work out. Of course, in general, esoteric rulers are employed when a degree of soul expression is coming into the life, and hierarchical rulers are employed when the expression of the spirit, the monad, is becoming somewhat real. Of course, the monad reflects itself in the mind. The monadic ray reflects itself in the mind. The soul ray reflects itself in the astral body, and the personality ray reflects itself in the physical body. So you can see this lesser subset of mind, emotions, and body as correlated with monad, soul, and personality. So there's probably a theoretical justification for doing as these often quite accomplished astrologers do. The question is how much of the content of mind, emotions, and body are actually revealed by applying these three sets of rulerships as presently applied. This is something which has to be laboriously established and not just remain a matter of theoretical interest. Continuing here, there may have been a little technical hiatus. So we have this method of looking at the three levels of planets related to the three lower vehicles, as each one of these vehicles represents one of the periodical vehicles. The physical body represents the personality as a periodical vehicle, the astral body represents the soul, causal body as a periodical vehicle, and then the mind represents the monad as a periodical vehicle. So DK is impressing upon us the importance of Scorpio and Mars. Not necessarily the most pleasant energies in the Libran sense of pleasantness, of harmony and beauty in the normal sense. He says, you will see from this how important are the functions of Scorpio and Mars upon our planet at this time, and you will note also how brief a time remains in which humanity can, rightly or wrongly, handle its tests. Now, when was this written? If it was written in 1945, then DK may be looking toward the future, which includes even our present era, saying that we are within that brief time wherein these tests must be handled. If it was written earlier, say in the 30s, then the question of the impending Second World War could have been considered. He says, you will realize also the pressure under which the hierarchy at this time struggles now that Martian energy is expressing itself upon the astral plane. Well, see, doesn't it almost look as if this section was written before the preceding section, which said the period of 1945 saw the highest expression of Mars, especially upon the astral plane? Let's see if we can. The year 1945 saw this influence almost completely vanish. And then down here, where we're reading, we see that, in fact, he's telling us something about now that the Martian energy is expressing itself upon the astral plane. So there's quite a difference between Martian energy almost completely vanishing in 1945 and the idea of Mars expressing itself strongly upon the astral plane, which suggests to me that the section we're now reading was written earlier than the section which preceded it. So humanity really had to handle its tests during the Second World War, if this was written in the 30s. And humanity could have gone down, and almost did, as we have been told, before the sun moved northward in 1942, when the hierarchy was packing its bags, so to speak, preparing to withdraw, believing that humanity would go down to defeat. But if this was written in the 30s, then apparently we have passed some tests and did not go down. At least then we did not go down. Hierarchy certainly struggles under pressures, even though their sense of time is completely different than our own. And even though they realize in a way the illusory nature of time as commonly understood, they do have time pressures and speak now of how brief a time remains. This is a master speaking, and he's speaking of time as we usually conceive it. Time as an aspect of the world of illusion with which we have to deal. Did humanity rightly handle its test? Did it sweep the devils out of the home? Later, perhaps, to find that more entered? Okay, but did it at least succeed excuse me, in the second phase of the war to clean house? Anyway, hierarchy was extremely mobilized during the period of the Second World War, and even in the Tibetan's communications with his students through Alice Bailey, we see the degree of his involvement, the degree of his preoccupation. At one point, 2 years passed between his communications to the group that he was cultivating. He must have been very busy indeed with the most pressing matters designed to help humanity succeed and not go down. Will the world Hercules lift this problem up into heaven and elevate the hydra of passion and hate, of greed and aggression, and of selfishness and ambition up into the region of the soul? Will these lower tendencies be seen? Will they be neutralized by that neutral form of electricity, solar fire? Will they be overcome, lifted up into the region of the soul? Or will humanity, the disciple, the world Hercules, carry the whole matter down onto the physical plane with the inevitable corollary of world disaster, world war, and death? Well, indeed, there was world disaster, world war, and death. In other words, it seems here that he's writing in such a sense that he's questioning whether there will be a second phase of the Great War, which ended with an armistice in 1918. would there be a second phase? Because they struggled mightily to prevent that second phase. And humanity, the world Hercules, did carry the whole matter down. And there was world disaster. There certainly was World War. We call it World War II. There was a huge reaping, culling of human beings through the processes of death, millions and millions. Such are the problems with which the guiding hierarchy is faced, and they are faced with it in the time sense. Now, if, for instance, this was written at the same time as a writing which could say when 1945 came, this occurred, so then in the 40s, then DK could be speaking of our present time and wondering whether we would succeed in avoiding world war, disaster, and death. And these things still face us, although he did say that the Shambhala impact of the year 2000 could be succeeded by perhaps less destruction than previous Shambhala impacts. So there's little ambiguity here. But certainly we can interpret it in both ways, and I think it makes a lot of sense to interpret this in terms of the possibly impending Second World War, which the hierarchy sought to avert through the good offices of the disciples of the world who were not powerful enough or perhaps numerous enough to avert world war. The question is still one which comes before us, especially in a nuclear age. I believe that hierarchy had so much rearranging of its plans due to the release of atomic energy through the atomic bomb. So much rearranging of its hitherto created plans, because the possibility of humanity truly annihilating itself quite permanently then loomed as a possibility. And DK did say it was a possibility which could be visioned, not some idle dream. So later DK will talk about the plans as they did exist for the reappearance of the Christ, I think, in the 20th century, and the plans as they had to be modified, I think, due to the very real appearance of atomic energy through atomic weaponry at the end of the Second World War. So hierarchy is faced with a great time problem and is trying to prevent, even now, humanity from going down in a still greater world disaster and greater world war and far more universal death than occurred even in the Second World War, which he said, I think, would be considered something like child's play compared to the war which could emerge. Scorpio is also most interestingly connected with the constellation Cancer through the influence of the sixth ray, coming via Neptune, correct? So there is the esoteric ruler Neptune and the hierarchical ruler Neptune conveying the sixth ray. Cancer itself, as a constellation, does not, related to the sixth ray of Mars. For it should be remembered that that ray is also expressing itself through Neptune, but in a spiritual and esoteric manner, related not to the blood, but to the life, as he is fond of saying. So, you know, the spiritualization of science is also related to Neptune and all of the psychic research which is underway. Neptune governs Cancer esoterically and also hierarchically. The significance is therefore clear. For Cancer is the sign of birth. It is the door into incarnation and the sign of generation. The processes of creating the physical vehicle are undertaken in Cancer. The incarnation, the sacral center processes leading to incarnation. So the moon is connected with that sacral center from some perspective, and the moon is also the ruler of Cancer. The desire for incarnation has created this descent into incarnation. Scorpio is the sign of sex and regeneration. Well, it's one of the signs of sex, Taurus being another, Libra being another. Scorpio is the sign of sex, which leads to physical incarnation in Cancer. I don't know how we would count that. Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, and then Aries, Taurus, Gemini. Well, if we count forward, we get 9 signs, and then the 10th sign being one of birth. So Scorpio is the sign of sex and of regeneration. So into matter and out of matter, regeneration, meaning that we generate ourselves and do not generate our own kind. My old teacher used to say that there comes a time in the life of every disciple when he ceases reproducing his own kind and then reproduces himself, which is interesting. The factor of regeneration has to do with building the new man in Christ, building the man who becomes the soul rather than the man who descends into incarnation. So true regeneration is, or the result of regeneration is occurring at the 4th initiation. But many things lead to that, a constant improvement on the generating of the self in its true nature. Scorpio is the sign of sex and of regeneration, both together, and birth in Cancer is ever the intended result of the sex relation. So DK seems to be making a comment about our present attitudes towards sexuality as something psychological, as something to promote perhaps better physical health, something that is simply an indulgence of the instinctual nature without thought of the intended result, which is ever intended. He seems to be a conservative in this respect, and I think we do have much to learn from his ideas here. The Dalai Lama pretty much said the same. So right now these sexual forces are being prostituted in many ways to the glorification of the lower ego. It's difficult to extricate oneself from those tendencies, but a greater perspective makes that possible. Ever the intended result of the sexual, of the sex relation. So sex leads to birth. Scorpio leads to Cancer. Father spirit and mother matter, when brought together, produce the son. And this is an extrapolation of the sexual relation toward a more cosmic perspective. The tests and difficulties and pains of this era are symptoms or indications of the entering into manifestation of the new civilization and culture. So Scorpio, by helping us to confront this pain which occurs when the soul descends into matter and attempts to establish its 5th kingdom within the realm of the 4th kingdom of nature. Scorpio assists with this descent, and the pains and difficulties are worth bearing. They are birthing pains, in essence. So these pains and difficulties, they portend, says DK, the birth of the new era, for which the entire world waits, and much of the waiting is actually unconscious waiting. This will happen if, and DK does open the possibility here of delay, if, speaking esoterically, the 6th ray energy of Mars is transmuted into the 6th ray energy of Neptune. For the one is objective and full of blood, and the other is subjective and full of life. That's the quotation, which defines very clearly the relationship between Mars and Neptune. We do need the Christ, who is Vishnu, who is Neptune, who represents the great subjective life, and who is the initiator of humanity for the first two initiations. Neptune is involved in that initiation process, producing essentially the mystic rather than the occultist. We need this very much. And the transmutative process is up to us. So I will end Esoteric Astrology Adventure 78B at this point, and we will see whether there will be a 78C or whether we will go on to 79. Let us together sound the great invocation. And it's good to see it for those who may not know it by heart. From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into the minds of men. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into the hearts of men. May Christ return to earth. From the center where the will of God is known, let purpose guide the little wills of men, the purpose which the masters know and serve. From the center which we call the race of men, let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. Okay, friends, we will move on with our discussion shortly. Continuing in the Scorpio chapter. We'll see you then.